Picture this: a crisp autumn morning in Central Park. Golden leaves spiral down from the trees as joggers and dog walkers navigate the winding paths. Among them, Timothy Walsh, a silver-haired man in his 60s wearing a worn military jacket, meticulously tends to a small patch of wild mushrooms growing near the base of an ancient oak tree. His weathered hands move with surprising grace as he carefully harvests a few specimens, placing them in a small paper bag. Across the path, Maxwell Sterling exits his chauffeur-driven Bentley, designer sneakers crunching on fallen leaves. The tech billionaire's attention is immediately drawn to Timothy's activities. With the entitlement of someone who's never heard the word no, Maxwell strides over, designer sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. "Those look interesting," Maxwell says, reaching for Timothy's carefully collected mushrooms without asking. "I've been getting into foraging lately. My private chef has been experimenting with wild ingredients." Timothy's hand shoots out with surprising speed, gripping Maxwell's wrist firmly. "Don't eat that," he warns, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who knows exactly what they're talking about. "These aren't what you think they are." Maxwell yanks his hand away, face flushing with indignation. "Do you know who I am? I own half this city," he snaps, straightening his custom Italian jacket. Timothy stands slowly, his eyes reflecting decades of life experience that money can't buy. "Sir, I'm just trying to stop you from making a serious mistake," Maxwell scoffs, pulling out his phone and taking a photo of the mushrooms. "We'll see about that," he mutters, stalking back to his waiting car. Timothy watches him go, shaking his head slowly. The billionaire's arrogance is about to collide with nature's indifference to wealth and status. And that collision was about to change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Let me take you back to where it all began. Timothy Walsh hadn't always called the park his home. 25 years in the army, including 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, had given him discipline, resilience, and a profound knowledge of survival skills. His specialty had been in field medicine and natural pharmaceuticals, skills that had saved countless lives during his military career. After his discharge, a combination of PTSD, a housing market collapse that took his savings, and a system ill-equipped to help veterans had gradually eroded his circumstances until the park became his most stable option. Yet Timothy maintained an immaculate appearance, rising before dawn each day to wash in the park restrooms. His small camp, hidden in a discreet corner of the park's wooded area, was organized with military precision. Fellow park regulars knew him as the helpful veteran who could identify any plant or mushroom, who volunteered at the community garden 3 days a week, and who never asked for anything despite his circumstances. Timothy had carved out a delicate existence for himself, building relationships with the local community. The coffee shop owners gave him day-old pastries and hot coffee. The librarians saved him interesting books on botany and mycology. He'd even established a small income by leading foraging tours for sustainability groups, and supplying a few local chefs with rare edible plants and mushrooms that he ethically harvested from the park's less trafficked areas. His particular pride was the small patch of rare medicinal mushrooms he'd carefully cultivated in a hidden corner of the park. He'd been nurturing this patch for 3 years, using specialized techniques he'd learned from a mycologist in Afghanistan. These weren't for eating, they had pharmaceutical properties that Timothy believed could help with his fellow veterans' PTSD symptom. He'd been documenting their growth meticulously, hoping to share his research with a scientist who could develop it further. Timothy felt a deep connection to this small ecosystem he'd helped cultivate. It was more than just mushrooms. It represented his contribution to society despite everything he'd lost. On crisp mornings like today, as sunlight filtered through the canopy onto his small mushroom colony, Timothy felt a rare sense of peace. What Timothy didn't know was that his little corner of the park had recently caught someone's attention. Maxwell Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Innovations, had purchased a $50 million penthouse overlooking this section of the park 3 months ago. The billionaire had developed a habit of watching the park through high-powered binoculars, noting Timothy's regular activities with growing curiosity and irritation. Maxwell had made his fortune developing predictive algorithms for the financial sector before expanding into pharmaceuticals and real estate. At 42, he possessed the confidence of someone who'd been told yes his entire life. The world was simply a collection of opportunities awaiting his attention, and anything that caught his interest automatically became something he felt entitled to possess. Recently, Maxwell had become obsessed with exclusivity in all forms: rare wines, limited artwork, and now, wild foods that weren't available to the masses. When he first spotted Timothy harvesting mushrooms, it wasn't the veteran himself who caught his attention, but rather what he was collecting. Maxwell's latest social circle was obsessed with foraging, and he was determined to showcase his superiority in this domain as well. As Timothy carefully harvested his mushrooms that morning, he had no idea that the tall figure watching him from the park bench would soon disrupt the fragile balance of his world. The next morning, Timothy arrived at his mushroom patch to find disturbing signs of interference. Someone had clearly been there. Several specimens had been clumsily harvested, leaving damage to the mycelium network underneath. Whoever had done this didn't understand the delicate ecosystem they were disrupting. Timothy crouched down, assessing the damage with a frown. 3 years of careful cultivation, potentially compromised by someone who didn't know what they were doing. He was placing protective coverings over the remaining specimens when a shadow fell across his work. "So this is where you hide the good stuff." Maxwell's voice carried the casual confidence of someone unused to being challenged. He stood there in running gear that probably cost more than what most people made in a week. Not a drop of sweat on him despite the supposed workout attire. Timothy stood slowly, his knees protesting after decades of military service. "Sir, did you disturb these mushrooms yesterday? I took a few samples. My chef said they weren't the same as the ones in his supplier catalog. Thought I'd come see, for myself, what makes them special." Maxwell stepped closer, eyeing the mushrooms like they were commodities on a trading floor. "What are they? Some kind of truffle hybrid?" "They're not edible mushrooms, sir. They're a rare medicinal variety I've been cultivating for research purposes." Timothy kept his voice level, respectful but firm. "They're also very fragile. The way they were harvested yesterday caused significant damage." Maxwell's eyebrows raised slightly, more amused than concerned. "Research? You?" His gaze swept over Timothy's worn jacket and weathered appearance. "Look, I'm happy to compensate you for whatever these are worth. Name your price. They're not for sale." Timothy carefully positioned himself between Maxwell and the mushroom patch. "This is a 3-year project that could potentially help veterans suffering from PTSD. Maxwell's laugh was short and dismissive. "Everyone has a price. How about $5,000 for the whole patch? That's generous considering." He gestured vaguely at Timothy's appearance. "Sir, with respect, these aren't about money. The research potential here. 10,000 then. Final offer." Maxwell pulled out his phone, already tapping at the screen. "I can have the money transferred immediately." Timothy shook his head. "I apologize, but these simply aren't for sale at any price." Something hardened in Maxwell's expression, a flash of anger at being denied. He slipped his phone back into his pocket. "You do realize this is public property? These mushrooms don't belong to you any more than they belong to me." "That's technically correct, which is why I've registered this as a citizen science project with the Parks Department. I have documentation and permission." Timothy reached into his backpack, withdrawing a laminated permit. Maxwell barely glanced at it. "Interesting. Well, I'll be looking into this further. I'm close friends with several members of the city council." He stepped back, appraising Timothy with newfound interest. "I always get what I want, one way or another. Remember that." As Maxwell walked away, Timothy felt a knot forming in his stomach. He'd encountered entitled people before, but something about Maxwell's casual confidence suggested this wasn't over. Timothy carefully finished tending to his damaged mushroom colony, then headed straight to the Parks Department office to ensure his permits were still in order. The weeks that followed confirmed Timothy's fears. Maxwell Sterling was a man used to getting his way, and being denied access to the mushrooms seemed to have triggered something between obsession and vendetta. It began with park security suddenly paying unusual attention to Timothy's activities. 2 officers approached him 3 days after his confrontation with Maxwell, questioning his permit and suggesting that his loitering was making park visitors uncomfortable. "I've been here for 5 years without incident," Timothy explained calmly, producing his permits once again. "The community knows me. I lead foraging tours for the Parks Department's education program." The officers exchanged glances. "We've received complaints from an influential resident," one finally admitted. "Just try to be less visible, okay?" Timothy nodded politely, but the encounter left him troubled. That same afternoon, he noticed Maxwell watching him from a distance, a satisfied smile playing on his lips when their eyes met briefly. Timothy decided to visit Maria Vasquez, the White Parks Department coordinator who had always supported his work. Her office was small but welcoming, filled with field guides and plant specimens. "Timothy, come in." Maria greeted him warmly, but her smile faded when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" He explained the situation with Maxwell and the security officers. Maria's face grew increasingly concerned. "This Maxwell Sterling, he's been making waves all over the city since he moved here. Donated $1 million to the Parks Conservancy last month." She lowered her voice. "There's talk about a revitalization project for your section of the park. Nothing official yet. But my mushroom research?" Maria sighed. I'll fight for it, Timothy. Your project has real scientific merit, and the veterans groups have expressed interest in your findings. Just be careful, okay? Sterling has connections everywhere. Timothy left Maria's office with renewed determination. This wasn't just about mushrooms anymore. It was about standing his ground against someone who thought money could buy anything, including the right to destroy others' work. The next day, Timothy arrived at his mushroom patch to find it completely disrupted. The protective coverings had been removed, and several specimens had been harvested, leaving gaping holes in the carefully maintained patch. This wasn't curiosity or ignorance. This was deliberate sabotage. As he knelt to assess the damage, his phone rang, one of the few luxuries he maintained to stay connected with veteran support services. "Is this Timothy Walsh?" an unfamiliar voice asked. "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Dr. Lena Chen from the University Research Hospital. I understand you've been conducting informal research on psilocybin variations for PTSD treatment?" Timothy's heart raced. This was exactly the kind of scientific attention he'd been hoping for. "Yes, I've been documenting growth patterns and developing a synthesis protocol based on traditional knowledge." "Fascinating. We'd be interested in seeing your work. Our department recently received a substantial grant to study alternative PTSD treatments." "That's wonderful. I'd be happy to share my findings." "Great. Our benefactor specifically mentioned your work. Mr. Sterling has been quite enthusiastic about bringing your research into a proper laboratory setting." Timothy's blood ran cold. "Maxwell Sterling is funding this?" A pause. "Yes. He's our primary donor for this initiative. Is that a problem?" Timothy closed his eyes briefly, seeing the pattern clearly now. "Dr. Chen, I'll need to think about this. May I call you back?" He ended the call and stared at his damaged mushroom patch. Maxwell's strategy was becoming clear. If he couldn't buy the mushrooms directly, he would control them through institutional means, positioning himself to take credit for any discoveries, while removing Timothy from the equation. That evening, as Timothy carefully salvaged what he could from his mushroom patch, an elegant black car pulled up on the nearby park drive. Maxwell emerged, walking casually toward him as if they were old friends. "Timothy, I've been looking for you." Maxwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you've heard the good news about the research funding." Timothy continued his work, without looking up. "I have." "Then you understand this is the best possible outcome. Your little project gets legitimized in a real laboratory, and veterans benefit. Everyone wins." Maxwell spread his hands magnanimously. "And you get exclusive rights to any pharmaceutical applications discovered," Timothy added quietly. Maxwell's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's business. The important thing is getting these mushrooms into professional hands. No offense, but you're hardly equipped to maximize their potential." Timothy finally stood, facing Maxwell directly. "These specimens won't survive transplantation to a lab environment. The protocols I've developed require specific soil conditions, and microbial relationships present only in this location. That's documented in my research, which I doubt you've actually read." Something dangerous flashed in Maxwell's eyes, the look of someone not accustomed to having his intelligence questioned. "The university will figure it out. That's what I'm paying them for. And if they can't, then perhaps these aren't as valuable as you believe." Maxwell stepped closer. "Either way, this area is being renovated next month. The parks commissioner signed off on it yesterday. A generous gift to the city from yours truly, so you might want to reconsider my offer while it still stands." As Maxwell walked away, Timothy realized the stakes had escalated dramatically. This wasn't just about his mushrooms anymore. It was about his home, his purpose, and his dignity. The billionaire was systematically dismantling the life Timothy had carefully rebuilt for himself. That night, Timothy sat in his hidden camp, poring over his research journals by lantern light. If Maxwell was determined to take control of his work, Timothy needed to ensure his contributions couldn't be erased. He began compiling his most significant findings, preparing documentation that established his intellectual property clearly. The next morning, Timothy visited the local Veterans Center where he volunteered twice weekly. His friend Jacob, who ran the center, listened intently to the developing situation. "This guy sounds like a piece of work," Jacob frowned. "But he's got deep pockets and we're barely keeping the lights on here. He actually reached out to us yesterday, offering a substantial donation." Timothy felt his heart sink. "Let me guess. Contingent on certain conditions?" Jacob nodded grimly. "He wanted information about you, said he was concerned about your welfare, and wanted to ensure you were receiving proper support. And I told him our veterans' records are confidential." Jacob's expression hardened. "Money's tight, but some things aren't for sale." Timothy felt a surge of gratitude toward his friend. "Thank you, Jacob. Just be careful, Tim. I looked this Sterling guy up. He doesn't take rejection well." When the founder of a competing tech company refused his buyout offer, Sterling orchestrated a systematic campaign to tank their stock value. The guy lost everything. Timothy nodded, the wheels already turning in his mind. I need to document everything. Can I use the center's computer? Over the next few days, Timothy implemented a monitoring system around his mushroom patch. Nothing sophisticated, just trail cameras borrowed from the Parks Department's wildlife monitoring program. Maria had helped him set them up, officially to document growth patterns. But both knew the real purpose was to catch Maxwell in the act if he tampered with the mushrooms again. Timothy also began cataloging every interaction with Maxwell, every suspicious incident, and every change in policy that seemed connected to the billionaire's influence. He downloaded copies of his original permits and research documentation, storing backups with trusted friends. During this time, Maxwell's pressure campaign continued. Timothy's usual coffee shops suddenly couldn't offer him day-old pastries anymore. Health department concerns, they said apologetically, after a surprise inspection. The community garden where he volunteered received a notice questioning their liability insurance coverage. Small, calculated disruptions to Timothy's support network that couldn't be directly tied to Maxwell, but formed a clear pattern. A week after installing the cameras, Timothy got the evidence he was waiting for. The footage clearly showed Maxwell and another man, likely his personal chef, harvesting several mushroom specimens in the early morning hours. More damning was their conversation, captured by the camera's microphone. Are you sure these are the ones you want, sir? The chef asked nervously. They don't look like any edible variety I recognize. The old man thinks they're valuable. That's good enough for me, Maxwell replied, carefully placing specimens in a container. Whether they're useful for my dinner, party, or for the pharmaceutical research, either way, I win and he loses. But sir, if they're not properly identified, just figure it out. That's what I pay you for. And make sure they're the centerpiece for tomorrow's dinner with the mayor. I want everyone talking about my exclusive forest-to-table experience. Timothy watched the footage 3 times, his concern growing with each viewing. Maxwell wasn't just stealing research materials. He was potentially putting people in danger. These mushrooms had never been tested for consumption. Their pharmacological properties were being studied for controlled microdosing, not as dinner party fare. The realization of what could happen struck Timothy like a physical blow. Maxwell was planning to serve untested, potentially psychoactive, mushrooms to the mayor and other guests. Even if they weren't toxic, the effects could be unpredictable and dangerous. Timothy sat in the park, weighing his options. He could go to the police, but would they take a homeless veteran's word against a billionaire's? He could try warning the dinner guests directly, but how would he even get access to Maxwell's penthouse? And even if he did nothing, was he then responsible for whatever happened to those unsuspecting people? As the sun set over the park, Timothy made his decision. He couldn't stand by and let Maxwell's arrogance potentially harm innocent people. But he also recognized an opportunity, perhaps the only one he would get, to make the billionaire face consequences in a way he couldn't buy his way out of. Timothy began preparing for what would come next. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability and protection. If Maxwell wanted to use these mushrooms as a status symbol without respecting their nature or purpose, he would learn a powerful lesson about consequences. The next evening, as preparations for Maxwell's exclusive dinner party were underway, Timothy positioned himself near the service entrance of the luxury building. He'd cleaned up as best he could, wearing the one decent outfit he kept for veteran events and job interviews. In his pocket was a small vial of activated charcoal solution, a precautionary antidote he'd prepared just in case. After observing for 20 minutes, he identified a pattern in the delivery arrivals. When a van from an upscale florist arrived, Timothy timed his approach perfectly, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. Last-minute delivery for the Sterling party, he said confidently to the security guard, who was distracted by signing for the floral arrangements. Chef said it's urgent. The guard barely glanced at him, waving Timothy toward the service elevator. Penthouse. Use the back kitchen entrance. Timothy's heart pounded as the elevator ascended. He wasn't here to confront Maxwell directly. That would accomplish nothing. Instead, he needed to assess the situation and prevent potential harm, while ensuring Maxwell faced the natural consequences of his actions. The penthouse kitchen was a flurry of activity, staff in crisp uniforms moving with practiced efficiency. Timothy spotted Maxwell's chef examining mushrooms at a preparation station, his expression troubled as he consulted a field guide. "Excuse me," Timothy approached quietly. "I believe you have concerns about those mushrooms." The chef looked up, startled. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows exactly what those are," Timothy replied evenly. "And they're not what you think." Recognition dawned on the chef's face. "You're the park forager. Mr. Sterling said you were just a—" He stopped himself. "A homeless person who doesn't matter?" Timothy finished for him. "That doesn't change the fact that those mushrooms aren't meant for consumption. They're part of a registered research project studying compounds for PTSD treatment." The chef paled. "Are they poisonous?" "Not exactly, but they contain compounds similar to those being studied for therapeutic microdosing. Serving full portions to unsuspecting guests could result in significant psychoactive effects. At minimum, it would be incredibly irresponsible." The chef looked from the mushrooms to Timothy and back again, conflict evident on his face. "Mr. Sterling insisted. He's been talking about these all week, telling everyone there's some exclusive variety only he has access to." "You have two options," Timothy said quietly. "Serve these and risk the health and well-being of your guests, possibly facing legal consequences yourself, or make the right choice." After a moment of consideration, the chef reached for his phone. "Mr. Sterling won't be happy." "Mr. Sterling created this situation himself," Timothy replied. "Sometimes privilege meets reality. Today might be that day." As the chef stepped away to make his call, Timothy heard Maxwell's voice approaching the kitchen. He slipped into a small storage pantry, leaving the door slightly ajar to observe. Maxwell burst into the kitchen, radiating irritation. "What? Do you mean you can't use them? This entire dinner was planned around my exclusive find." The chef stood his ground, displaying more courage than Timothy had expected. "Sir, multiple sources have confirmed these aren't suitable for consumption. The effects could be unpredictable and potentially dangerous." "Sources? What sources?" Maxwell demanded. "I consulted with a mycologist at the university. These match a variety being studied for their psychoactive properties. They're not culinary mushrooms." Maxwell's face flushed with anger. "You're telling me that homeless veteran was right? That's absurd." "Sir, the safety of your guests—" "Fine, fine." Maxwell ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his composure slipping. "What am I supposed to serve now? The mayor and 3 city council members are already in my living room, expecting to be amazed. We have excellent black truffles from France that arrived this morning. I can adjust the menu." "Truffles? Truffles?" Maxwell's voice rose dangerously. "Anyone with money can serve truffles. The entire point was exclusivity, something no one else could access." As Maxwell continued berating his staff, Timothy quietly exited the pantry and slipped out through a service door. He'd accomplished what he came to do, prevented potentially dangerous mushrooms from being served. But the evening's consequences for Maxwell were just beginning. Timothy made his way to the building's lobby, where he approached the concierge desk. "Excuse me, I'm concerned about something occurring at Mr. Sterling's dinner party, and I believe the guests should be informed." The concierge regarded him suspiciously. "Sir, if you don't have business here." Timothy placed his veteran's ID on the counter. "My name is Timothy Walsh. I'm a mycologist specializing in psychoactive compounds. Mr. Sterling harvested research specimens from my registered study site and planned to serve them to his guests tonight, including the mayor." The concierge's expression shifted from dismissive to alarmed. "Are you saying Mr. Sterling was going to—" "I've prevented that from happening," Timothy assured him. "But I believe his guests deserve to know how close they came to being unwitting." "Test subjects. I've documented everything, including video evidence of Mr. Sterling harvesting the mushrooms despite clear warnings." As Timothy spoke, a woman in an elegant dress approached the desk, clearly listening. "Excuse me," she said, extending her hand. "Angela Chen, Daily Metro. Did I hear correctly that Maxwell Sterling attempted to serve psychoactive research mushrooms to the mayor?" Timothy hadn't planned for media involvement, but recognized an opportunity for accountability that Maxwell couldn't simply buy his way out of. "I have documented evidence, yes, including Mr. Sterling's dismissal of safety concerns." The reporter's eyes widened. "Would you be willing to share that evidence on record?" Upstairs, Maxwell's perfect evening was unraveling spectacularly. Word had somehow spread among his guests about the mushroom incident. The mayor had made a hasty exit, citing scheduling conflicts. Other guests were leaving too, whispering among themselves. Maxwell stood in his expansive living room, watching his carefully cultivated social capital evaporating before his eyes. His phone buzzed with a news alert. "Breaking. Billionaire Maxwell Sterling accused of attempting to serve psychoactive mushrooms to mayor and city officials." Attached was a still from Timothy's trail camera footage, clearly showing Maxwell harvesting the mushrooms, despite posted warnings about the research project. The next morning, Timothy sat on his usual park bench, reading the news coverage on a tablet borrowed from the Veterans Center. The story had exploded overnight. Maxwell's dinner party fiasco was trending across social media, with additional revelations emerging about his attempts to seize control of the park section and the research project. Timothy had been careful to focus solely on facts in his statements to the press. He described the research project, the proper permits he held, the documented warnings he'd given Maxwell, and the potential effects the mushrooms could have had on unsuspecting dinner guests. He never attacked Maxwell personally, or speculated about his motivations. That restraint made the story even more damning. Maxwell, by contrast, had responded with increasingly defensive and contradictory statements, first denying he'd taken the mushrooms, then claiming he'd had permission, then suggesting the whole thing was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by an unstable homeless person. Each attempt to control the narrative only deepened public interest. By midday, several of Maxwell's dinner guests had come forward confirming the story. The chef, who had resigned that morning, provided his own statement about being pressured to serve ingredients he had concerns about. Most significantly, Maria from the Parks Department had released the full documentation of Timothy's research project, including its potential benefits for veterans suffering from PTSD. The contrast between Timothy's careful, properly permitted, scientific work and Maxwell's entitled disregard for safety and protocol couldn't have been clearer. By afternoon, what had started as a local scandal had attracted national attention. Maxwell's reputation for bullying tactics and buying influence had preceded him, and suddenly people were coming forward with similar stories from other cities. The narrative was shifting from one specific incident to a pattern of behavior, from a man who believed his wealth placed him above rules and consequences. Timothy watched it all unfold with mixed emotions. He hadn't wanted or expected this level of attention, but he understood its importance. This wasn't just about mushrooms, or even about him personally. It was about accountability, in a system often weighted toward power and privilege. 3 days later, Timothy arrived at his mushroom patch to find Maxwell waiting for him. The billionaire looked different, disheveled, his designer clothes slightly rumpled, dark circles under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "You've destroyed my reputation," Maxwell said without preamble, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Timothy regarded him calmly. "You did that yourself, Mr. Sterling. I simply documented. Do you have any idea what this has cost me? The mayor won't return my calls. 2 board members have resigned from my foundation. My company stock is down 12%. Actions have consequences," Timothy replied simply, "even for billionaires." Maxwell's expression shifted between anger and something resembling confusion. "I offered you money. I offered you lab resources. I could have made you comfortable for the rest of your life. I don't think you understand what comfort really means, Mr. Sterling. It isn't about money. It's about purpose and respect." Maxwell stared at him, genuinely perplexed. "What do you want from me? An apology? Fine. I apologize. Now, let's discuss how to fix this." Timothy shook his head slowly. "I don't want anything from you, Mr. Sterling. That's what you never understood. Not everyone and everything is for sale." As if on cue, Maria from the Parks Department approached, accompanied by 2 university researchers. "Timothy, there you are. Dr. Rivera and Dr. Kim are very excited about your research protocol. The university's ethics board has approved the veteran study, with you retained as a primary consultant." Maxwell watched the interaction with dawning comprehension. The very outcome he had tried to orchestrate and control, moving Timothy's research to the university, was happening. Naturally, but with Timothy receiving proper credit and maintaining involvement. "Mr. Sterling," Maria acknowledged his presence coolly, "the Parks Commission has reviewed your renovation proposal and determined it conflicts with existing community science projects. Your donation is being returned with thanks." Maxwell's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, watching as Timothy discussed technical details with the scientists, clearly their peer, despite his circumstances. The billionaire finally turned and walked away, his usual commanding presence diminished. 1 year later, the scene in the park had transformed. Timothy's mushroom research had expanded into a formal university partnership, with a small research station established near the original growth site. Timothy himself, while still often found in the park, now had proper housing through a veterans program and a part-time position as a research consultant. The pathway near his original mushroom patch had been dedicated as a medicinal plant, educational trail, with plaques explaining the various species and their potential benefits. School groups and tourists regularly visited, guided by volunteers Timothy had trained. Maxwell Sterling had sold his penthouse shortly after the mushroom incident and relocated to another city. His reputation had never fully recovered, especially after investigative journalists uncovered similar patterns of behavior in his business dealings. The experience had cost him financially, but more importantly, It had exposed the limits of what wealth could insulate him from. Timothy sat on his favorite bench, watching a group of veterans touring the medicinal plant trail. The first clinical trials using compounds derived from his mushroom research were showing promising results for PTSD treatment. What had begun as a personal project of survival and purpose had blossomed into something that might help thousands. A young reporter approached, notebook in hand. "Mr. Walsh? I'm doing a follow-up story on urban conservation projects. Do you have a moment?" Timothy smiled. "Of course. It's been a year since the incident with Maxwell Sterling. Looking back, what do you think is the most important lesson from that experience?" Timothy considered the question carefully. "I think it's that true value isn't determined by price tags or social status. Real worth comes from respect, for nature, for knowledge, for other people's boundaries. When we forget that, we create imbalance." "And do you think Mr. Sterling learned that lesson?" Timothy gazed across the park, where new spring mushrooms were emerging in their natural cycle of growth and renewal. "I can't speak for him, but I hope the experience left him with something money can't buy: perspective." The reporter nodded, jotting notes. "One last question. What would you say to others facing similar situations, where power seems so unbalanced?" "I'd say remember that even the mightiest systems can be shifted by small acts of principled resistance. Document everything, know your rights, and understand that entitlement, no matter how wealthy or powerful its source, eventually collides with reality." As the reporter left, Timothy returned to his observation of the veterans walking the trail, some stopping to examine the mushroom research station with interest. The path they walked was the same one where Maxwell had once demanded ownership of something that was never his to take. Some battles were worth fighting, not for revenge, but for restoration of balance. In standing his ground, Timothy hadn't just protected his research. He demonstrated that dignity and principle could still prevail in a world that too often confused price with value. If you've ever stood your ground against someone who thought their status put them above the rules, I want to hear your story. Leave a comment below sharing how you handled an entitled person who tried to take what wasn't theirs. Did you find a clever way to hold them accountable? What happened afterward? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more true stories of everyday justice. Remember, sometimes the most powerful response to entitlement isn't anger. It's simply standing firmly in your truth and letting consequences unfold naturally. Until next time, remember that respect isn't bought, it's earned.